I don't know how much of my life has been spent driving for a living, but I think that the time constitutes most of my adult life if we allow for forklifts and being kept as a domestic lover and housekeeper. The latter because both of the times I've lived as such involved a lot of driving my glucosal mother figure hither and thither. Suffice to say, aside from the times that I've had a princess mommy to keep me in my recommended supply of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, I have usually made my trade in the transportation of goods and passengers. This has been at every level, from a forklift driver in a warehouse to a taxi driver, all the way up to both long-haul and short-haul trucking. In the past, when friends have wanted to travel, they usually approach me as the designated driver for long, out-of-state voyages, and one time I even crossed state lines just to go pick somebody up from a wedding that was going on a little too long. Befitting my status as a sort of fat knockoff Jason Statham, I do have a few tales tucked away in the sleeves of my studded leather jacket, beneath the letters tattooed on my fingers, which read Road Wolf, and also alert everybody who meets me far better than the semen drying on my lapel that I am possibly the most homosexual man who has ever made love to a woman. Today on Therapy Session, I will attempt to dig out a few of the better ones if I can remember them well enough, and we will recount them while you paint your miniatures or brew a mug of tea or whatever it is the 5 of 6 of you, or how many ever there are up to right now. The first story is set during my time as a delivery driver for Domino's Pizza. As glamorous as it sounds, the truth about it is that the pizza delivery drivers are not they're not rock stars. They're not living these glamorous lifestyles that you're picturing. I know you've seen the classic pornography featuring the pizza boy who is called upon to deliver his extra sausage to the lonely housewife. During approximately 5 years delivering pizza, I only saw a naked woman 3 times. One time the woman was so filthy, odorous, and obese that only the most extreme overlap space in a Venn diagram of fetishes could result in any person being aroused by the experience. The second time was better because the person who exposed themselves to me was far above my admittedly low standards of physical beauty, only that the woman in question was currently fainting and out of sorts in a way that wasn't what I would call attractive. I arrived to bring her the pizza she had set up an order for much earlier in the day before what I'm assuming was either a massive drinking binge or the sudden onset of extreme multiple sclerosis. Because when I knocked on the door, this beautiful young woman answered wrapped in a towel with her eyes swollen and baggy. She staggered as she walked to the coffee table in her living room to find her purse and pay, and then outright collapsed on the floor when trying to turn back to me. I set down the pizza and moved to help her up onto her sofa, at which point she discarded her towel and began to cry. I asked if she needed me to call for help of some kind, or if she needed me to stay for a while and help her get dressed and get in bed. She flatly refused and tipped me very generously for the pizza, probably because she didn't want to wait for me to count out the change or because she was too embarrassed for me to hang around, and told me she could manage on her own once she just had a bit to eat. The third time I saw a naked woman was at last the fabled bored housewife all of the other drivers told lies about on the internet in Penthouse Forum's official online forums. She had ordered online and neglected to order a drink. She asked if I could get her one anyway, or if it would be too much trouble, promising me something nice if I helped her out. This happened often enough, so I actually kept a few extra drinks in my car and went out to get her one as I usually do. And when I knocked on her door again a few minutes later, she took some time to answer but eventually came to the door entirely nude, with 2 $20 bills carefully held between her breasts. She asked me if I liked them, and I replied in the affirmative. Next, she asked me if I'd like to rummage around with them with my hands. I, of course, replied that I would very much enjoy the opportunity. I then spent about 2 minutes testing their weight with my hands and moving them around in a few directions to satisfy myself that they were, in fact, adequate mammaries, before I nervously asked the woman if she wanted me to let her go and eat. She gave me a kiss on the cheek, and I retired to my car with my $40 to wonder at length what might have happened if I'd asked to come in. After all, even though I'm paraphrasing the language in this archaic, business-like manner for comedic effect, it's not as though I'm exactly Cary Grant over here. Regardless, none of these things are even the story. No, the story involves the opposite of a naked woman, a fully clothed man in a mask. In the time that I delivered pizza, I was the victim of attempted robbery at least 5 times. Successful robbery if you count the theft of the pizza, but I don't, because other than them taking 10 pizzas out of my car on some occasion, I was left unmolested. My co-workers experienced similar exchanges with the local rogues gallery, only that they were not left as untouched. One of my female co-workers even had the misfortune of catching quite the glaring shiner off of one of these robbing hoods. The difference between myself and them, I think, is that I really do not care for Domino's policies on weapons. The company, as a whole, has always been against their drivers carrying weapons of any sort, to the point where they have even fired drivers for using weapons to defend themselves during a violent robbery. I ignored this policy flagrantly, often even telling my managers and regional managers that I had a loaded revolver, and watching as they tried to pretend not to hear it to such a comical degree that I even once had a regional manager miming the act of cleaning oven vents without even a rag in his hand. On every occasion that robbery was attempted, I would drop the pizza in my hand and dash for the nearest cover, while drawing my Ruger and thumbing back the hammer. I never fired the gun once in my career as a Domino's driver. Usually at the sight of the gun, my attackers would flee or at least freeze up and carefully give me space to get back in my car and drive away. Once they just snatched the pizza out of my hand and dashed for the trees without even paying me any attention, so that I sat there behind the rear end of my car with what may as well have been my own cock in my hand rather than a loaded .357, looking all the world like an imbecile, I'm sure. On the night of the story, however, the person I almost shot wasn't even trying to rob me, or so he claimed. It was Halloween in Inner City Montgomery. I don't know what it's like in every neighborhood there, but in the area around Highland Avenue where I worked, you are not like to see children gaily parading the sidewalks with plastic pumpkins overflowing with diabetes-inducing Nerds Rope segments, or candy corn that I am still convinced to this day is merely aspartame and earwax. The locals in that neighborhood prefer more adult festivities to what you're used to seeing on All Saints' Eve here in the States. Block parties are favorite, or sometimes just smaller groups of friends grilling out and enjoying some of the fine products of Alabama's enterprising small-batch organic street-side pharmaceutical vendors. For somebody in the pizza business, this can be a great night to make some extra cash. Drunk and high people tip generously and buy way more food than they need, and business is booming. On the other hand, drivers are often the victim of dangerous gaffes. If somebody from the company told me that they wait until after Halloween to update the car top signs so they can just replace the ones that have all been stolen or destroyed by makeshift tripwires, I would believe them without hesitation. On this particular Halloween, I was dispatched on a delivery that definitely sent up a red flag from the start. The call came from a number that used VoIP. The food was not paid for over the phone, and it was directed to a house in a neighborhood where at least one of our drivers had been robbed on 2 separate occasions. Still, we are forced to take these orders without more substantial evidence than just having a bad feeling about it. When I arrived at the residence in question, it appeared to be abandoned, an empty, disused house with no lights on. Still, I'd mistakenly avoided similarly disused and vacant-looking properties before, only to find out that they indeed had an occupant who was angrily missing their pizza. So I stuffed my revolver into my waistband holster and approached the front door with my breath tight in my chest. Right on cue, as my feet were firmly on the front porch of this dilapidated home, there emerged a would-be specter from behind the house. He was not a tall man, somewhat thin in his close-fitting jeans and hooded black sweatshirt. More importantly, though, he was wearing the mask of the villain, or perhaps the protagonist of the Scream franchise of horror graphic cinema. It's a very long, white face cast in a perpetual shriek with sad, downturned eyes. I think it may be inspired by a painting of Edvard Munch's. This face is what I was looking down at as my attacker emerged from behind the house, clenching an aluminum baseball bat in both hands and roaring like he was charging into battle. I followed my usual danger protocol of dropping the pizza and lurching away while drawing my revolver and thumbing back the hammer. When I turned back from my cover on the other side of the porch and found my attacker still charging, I thrust the revolver towards him as if it would somehow improve my aim and felt my finger tense over the trigger. In my head, the decision to risk killing this person was made, and the consequences were to be damned. But as I waited for his torso to fill my sights, he stumbled and fell. His hands were clasped tightly over the back of his head, and he was wailing. He was begging me not to kill him, assuring me that he was never going to hurt me, had never intended to hurt me. This whole routine of bursting from the shadows with a baseball bat and screaming towards me at full tilt was merely some kind of humorous jape. A prank. I did not holster my gun, but I did have the decency to point it at the ground and extract my nose picker from the trigger guard. It took some time for my comedian friend to collect himself, during which I carefully pondered just how close I had come to ending a man's life, and just how easy it was for me to make the decision to do so. Eventually, I negotiated the surrender of the mask and the baseball bat, and this put me at significant ease. My comedian friend sat rocking on the front porch of his dilapidated house, chuckling and wiping his red, swollen eyes before asking me if he could just pay for the pizza and let me go on my way without either of us having to roll the dice on our treatment at the hands of the local constabulary, who could be capricious at the best of times and downright comic themselves with the same sense of humor as my new acquaintance at the worst of times. I was handed $30 for a $14 pizza that had certainly been ruined. I still have the baseball bat piled away in some storage box or another. All in all, something of a decent payment for having to know for the rest of my life that I am capable of killing another person. Let's visit a more light-hearted memory to wash the taste of that one out of my mouth. This one is a few years earlier. Around the end of one of my stints acting as a kept woman, I am moving back to town and living in my old apartment again. I enjoy a brief period as a telemarketer, which doesn't end well for me, followed by a short time on the freelance circuit driving around a drug dealer. In need of more substantial pay, I opted to work for the local branch of Yellow Cab, the iconic taxi company that you tend to see in all the movies taking place in New York or Chicago. I don't know how it is in either of those places, but in the hot and sweaty hillbilly South, the job is grueling. One is responsible for the gas, cleaning, and maintenance of his vehicle. One must work 72-hour weeks in 6 consecutive 12-hour shifts. Finally, one does all this not for the lofty sum you might imagine, but instead for the hope that one day he will be able to buy his own retired police cruiser and lease it out to the company for a larger share of profits that would justify the actual time spent working. Eventually, if you play your cards right, you can even ascend to the loftier peaks of being a person who is leasing multiple cabs to the company and find yourself with more assets than business, slowly watching your savings dwindle whenever there's a slow season. Naturally, I declined to remain in this employment long and instead opted to spend many of my shifts either napping on my sofa at home while waiting for a fare to come in over the phone, or just driving the taxi to various places of business to fill out applications for jobs working for them. I did, however, often spend time actually ferrying customers around. On these occasions, I was often left with piles of candy wrappers and cigarette ashes on my freshly vacuumed seats. Customers would berate me for taking a different way than the one they knew to their favorite destination, even when it saved them money. Other times, they would complain about me running the meter while they went into the grocery store for an hour to do their weekly shopping. Lastly, of course, there were the people who insisted I calculate the fare using the odometer and the route plotted on an atlas, because they were certain that I had somehow rigged the meter to cheat them out of their money. As insulted as I was that they would accuse me of having the mystical knowledge that I presume is necessary to summon the proper demons into the obsidian slab that is the taxi fares meter, the more direct process usually ended up with them paying 30 to 60 cents more. It would have been more gratifying if they didn't than usually pay me a few dimes less and then duck out of my cab before I could finish counting the money. The job also had its benefits, like the time a man paid me to fuck his wife, for instance. Okay, so it wasn't quite like that. You see, there was a customer I really liked. There were a few, actually. Glowing examples of kindness and humanity in an otherwise bleak world of cheapskates, and one guy who literally shit himself in my cab out of protest to the high price of 30 cents for 1/3 of a mile after the $2.50 minimum. I had an elderly woman who would wrap the fare money around mint and delight in speaking to me as if I were her private chauffeur, so long as I also adopted the manner of Worcester's own Jeeves. "It is just so, as Madam wishes. I do not believe the Church's Chicken to be an inadequate establishment for your midday libations, madam. Would Madam prefer to visit the drive-through?" There was another guy who spent the entire trip guzzling beer every time with his feet propped between the seats, making racist jokes about anybody and everybody he saw outside, no matter what color they happened to be. He always tipped well and told me to stay cool when he got out. And finally, there was one woman who seemed to just want to be my friend. She was a black woman, probably just under 40 years old, with large, bright eyes and carefully styled hair. She always wore these brightly colored sundresses and smiled very cheerfully whenever she saw it was me who came to pick her up. She sat up in the front seat with me, and we often talked about theater or music while I drove her to the grocery store. We had very similar tastes in literature as well, as it would eventually turn out. The same sense of humor, more or less macabre, irreverent. Over the weeks that I had that job, she and I talked about everything except for each other and ourselves in a way that two people can only when they really have chemistry. In case you couldn't tell where this was going, I grew to like her in a fonder way when we got to this stage of friendship. I started complimenting her dress, her smile, or even just telling her how nice it was to hear the sound of her voice after a long day with the other customers. I don't know when I turned my compliments to things like her legs or the pleasant caramel hue of her skin, but she took them just as receptively as the others. One day, she called the cab company and asked for me by name, claiming she'd left something in my cab earlier that day. When I arrived, she asked if I was willing to drive her around for a little while free of charge, just so the two of us could talk. We were riding around the bypass when she said that she often felt lonely because the other people in her life didn't understand her. They weren't stupid per se, they just didn't value the arts or philosophy or having an education. That was why she said she looked forward to her weekly shopping trips, because it usually meant she was going to run into me. I never considered myself pretentiously well-read exactly, but I'd be lying if I claimed I'd never gotten a compliment like this before. You see, it may be hard to believe, but understand that I don't actually talk like this in real life. I can't believe you seriously imagined me going into the corner convenience store and demanding of the fellow behind the glass, "Dispense to me your finest cigarillo and a flavor of Mad Dog 2020 that pairs well with marijuana and Werner's ginger ale, sir." Either way, with her confession, I feel that the time has come for me to do the same. I tell her that ever since we began talking together, I think of her often, and that I have found myself woefully attracted to her. She suggests that perhaps we may enjoy a stimulating session of intense coitus in the back of my cab in the parking lot of my choosing. Knowing the best parking lots in the city due to my profession, I elect to visit a long unused Presbyterian house of worship with charming creeping vines that obscure the view from the road and presumably also the local constabulary, who, as we've mentioned before, can be quite capricious. After a clumsy transfer of our bodies into the back seat, we hastily disrobe and make sweaty, passionate love with the engine still running and the air conditioner gusting at full blast. Then we relax in each other's arms, and for the first time since taking the job, I feel happy that I've done it. We share a cigarette with the window cracked, and she tells me about her secret savings for a trip to Paris. I don't tell her that I think Paris is a horrible place that reeks of dog shit and that everybody just thinks it's fancy because it's been billing itself as the fancy place for centuries, or that I think she's more sophisticated than just about anybody else who thinks Paris is the sophisticated place to visit. Instead, I just tell her that my ambitions are limited to a trip to the local gun store for a quick chuckle, and then I begin to kiss her neck. Jazz is playing on the radio. She recognizes it better than I do. She hums along to a few bars of the song while I kiss her shoulders and begin what I think might be round 2 of our adventures in the back of the taxi. And then her phone rings. Gingerly, she pushes me out of the way so she can retrieve it from the front seat. Upon answering, the first thing I hear is a man's voice asking where she is. She answers truthfully that she's in a cab. The man on the other end explains that he is hungry and wants to know when she'll return home. She says she'll come back right away and apologizes for leaving without saying anything. He tells her it's not a problem and not to rush, but I can tell by the look on her face that she's not going to engage my services as anything other than a taxi driver any longer that day. When I ask who called, she admits it was her husband. I hadn't been aware she was married before, and she also admitted that she hadn't planned on telling me about it. I candidly asked her how often she met guys to cheat on, and she told me without hesitation that this was the first time she'd ever done it. I asked her if she was disappointed, and she very sweetly told me that it had been worth it. Of course, I had to drive her home. When I got there, this husband was waiting on the front porch. He was such a nice guy. He came down and greeted me politely, and after he shook my hand, he stuck his head in the car to ask his wife if she didn't want more time because we'd gotten back there so quickly. He told her he could wait or order out if they had to. She got out of the cab and went inside with some vague pleasantries, and then the man asked me what the damage was. But I hadn't been running the meter at all during the ride, so it was sitting there blank. Fumbling, I hastily used the recall function to bring up the last fare in memory, and it rang him up for $13.60, if I remember correctly. It was far too much for such a short trip from the church back to his house, but I guess he probably didn't know his wife was there in the back of the cab, fucking a hairy, overweight, overeducated millennial. He handed me $18 and thanked me for bringing his wife home so quick, and then sent me on my way. I don't know what my customer thought about all of this, because she stopped calling the cab company altogether after that. And it wasn't too much longer before I quit the job entirely. We never saw each other again. What I really can't believe is how the guy more or less accidentally paid me for fucking his wife. I mean, I couldn't say anything or he'd know, and who knows how quickly he'd have killed me or her. For all I know, he might have even just laughed at me because of how ridiculous the notion was that his wife could see anything in somebody so much younger and uglier than him. I didn't want to risk it, though, so I just had to take his money. So not only did he pay me to fuck his wife, but he tipped me for it, too. What a fucking stupid world we live in sometimes.